Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. My guest today is fiction writer Yaa Gyasi, whose debut novel, Homegoing, has been one of the publishing events of this literary season. Homegoing, which begins in 1750, tells the story of 8 generations of descendants of 2 sisters in Ghana, one sold into slavery in America, the other an immigrant to America, but not until the late 20th century. I spoke with Yaa Gyasi during the annual Alabama Writers Symposium in the Old Courthouse Museum in Monroeville, Alabama. Miss Gyasi, it is a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
We're down in Monroeville. This must be your first time here.
It is actually my first time in Monroeville.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time, because I know you're going to be not so busy today, but over the next day or two, you're going to have plenty to do.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the whole conference.
Right.
I've never been before.
You'll give the lunch talk tomorrow?
Yes.
And sign a pile of books, I hope.
Yes, exactly.
This is your first time on Bookmark, and I always ask a first-time guest for a little biography, but in your case, it's absolutely required because you have an unusual biography. You were born where? You moved to where? You were educated where?
I was born in Ghana in a town called Mempo, and then we moved to America when I was 2, and we lived in Ohio, Illinois, Tennessee, and then Alabama. And we moved to Huntsville, Alabama when I was 9, and that's where I did most of my growing up from age 9 until college. And then I left for college at Stanford, stayed there for 4 years, and then moved to San Francisco the year after that to work. And then went to graduate school in Iowa, lived there for 3 years, went back to California, and now I'm in New York.
All right. Well, that's a travel. Your father's an academic, right?
Yes, he teaches French language and Francophone African literature at the University of Alabama in Huntsville.
He must have learned French in Ghana.
No, actually.
No.
I mean, I think he took French classes, as you do anywhere, but Ghana is an Anglophone country, so he wasn't speaking it at home or anything. He went to Senegal and studied abroad there.
That is not something I would have imagined.
Yeah.
Senegal for French, and then
on to America. Yeah.
You could torture me before I told you the name of a Senegalese university, but I'm sure they're there.
They are there.
Right,
yes.
Right. About half your life has been spent not in your travels at Stanford, in San Francisco, in Iowa City. All that while, I understand, you've been working on this book.
Yes.
Those years and more.
Yeah, it took me about 7 years to write the book.
And I'm sure this is painful, but why? What? It wasn't a quantitative problem, was it? It was a question of finding the right direction, finding the right structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I first started the novel, I had taken a trip to Ghana in order to do research, and I wound up at the Cape Coast Castle.
Right.
And I took the tour that they give to any tourist, and we got to see the slave dungeons, and we see the cannons facing out to the sea, and I kind of immediately knew what I wanted to write about. I just didn't know how I was going to do it. The kind of weight of all that history just seemed like too much for a book. And so I went down this, incorrect path for about 3 years, where I had a novel that was completely different in structure, one that was a lot more traditional, set in the present with some flashbacks to 18th century Ghana. And the longer I worked on it, the more I realized that I was more interested in the idea of being able to follow something very closely over a long period of time. And it was that factor of time that made me change the structure so that I could stop in as many generations as possible.
Your novel takes place in countless places. Yeah. I mean, the African half, you have the 2 sisters. One marries an Englishman. One is caught and sent to America as a slave. And then you have 7 more generations, right? There are countless scenes in now finally 4 centuries.
Yeah.
Yes, 4 centuries. You set up a really challenging, you alternate too, and pretty much alternate from the history of one sister's descendants to the history of the other sister's descendants.
Right.
Very complicated structure.
Right. Yes.
And this is what you settled on. This is what you wanted. What were the advantages of visiting different characters and different scenes in different centuries so briefly? I mean, it worked for you. Why did you want to do it that way?
Well, I wanted a reader to kind of be able to feel the full sweep of time as they read. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes you read a book about slavery and you leave it thinking, well, that happened 1,000,000 years ago and it has no bearing on our present. It has no bearing on my life today. And this structure allowed me to kind of be able to track how these things led to these things, which led to these things, which led to these things, which led to where we are now. And that concept of something kind of moving and shifting location after location, time period after time period, was the thing that kind of glued this novel together.
The effect of slavery is more obvious on your, I never get the 2 sisters' names. Which one is which? The sister who was sold into slavery in
Essie.
1750, Essie. That line, that line of descendants, you make it clearer that they suffer the effects of what happened in 1750.
Absolutely.
Slavery's not over with in America, if I understand the novel rightly.
No, I think this novel is dealing with the legacy of slavery. The idea that slavery has left us with something, some kind of inheritance. And on Essie's side, you get to see that really clearly from, she ends up in the South. Her daughter lives in a plantation in Alabama. Her grandson ends up in Baltimore, and then is entangled with the Fugitive Slave Act. This kind of movement from one particularly traumatic event in history to another, I think, shows the way that things continued to follow.
And is it fair to say that not in a good way?
Not in a good way.
Is there? And this would never occur to me to ask before, but
yeah.
Is there anything? One sees the negative effects, the burdens, the struggles that have to be overcome. Are there any positive? Is there anything positive that gets handed down aside from courage?
Well, I think courage is important,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
the
sure.
idea not just of courage, but of this kind of will to survive.
Uh-huh.
And that will, I think, in many cases, certainly in this novel, but I'm sure in real life too, comes from this deep, abiding love for your family and the hope that, even if things aren't great for me, I can perhaps create a better life for my children. And so in a lot of ways, the traumatic events continue throughout this novel, but also each character, I think, is leaving something incrementally better for their descendant than the previous character was able to.
One scene, as I mentioned earlier, that I was really taken with, one chapter, was the family in Baltimore. In a free state, in a free city, and the Fugitive Slave Act is passed,
right.
And suddenly their lives are under threat. That was some interesting tension, some interesting drama there.
Yeah. I was really fascinated by the idea that slavery could follow you. You could think that you had escaped it somehow, and then suddenly you're just sucked back in. And so that character that you're talking about, Kojo, he's a runaway. He escapes and then thinks that he's made it to freedom, and then all of a sudden, 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act passes, and suddenly you're caught back up. You're uncertain yet again whether or not you're able to stay free. And this happened, to countless families, where suddenly you're back in the throes of something you thought that you had escaped.
And it instills a kind of terror into everyday life.
Yeah.
Not just an invading army, but a kind of miasma that this could happen any minute, any time, anywhere.
Right. Oh, and it implicated white families as well, because you could be fined if you were hiring a black person who was suspected to be a slave. So it really kind of brought everything into this storm.
Isn't it amazing that Canada has been the promised land for a lot of Americans for the last 200 years?
Absolutely, yeah.
Not just the Vietnam War era, not just today, but 1750 as well.
Yeah.
In a sense, the legacy of American slavery comes right up into Harlem into the 1920s, and you very candidly lay out the problems of family breakdown and drugs in New York City in the 20th century.
Right.
And you do see a kind of continuum there, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the character who ends up in Harlem, Willie, she's a part of that vast migration that we call the Great Migration, where essentially Black Americans were finding the South unlivable and moved in droves to places in the North that were more accepting.
Yeah.
And yet, again, throughout history, you can't escape. You can't escape your roots. You can't escape your past. And so many of the problems that they'd had down south followed them up to the north.
We were very lucky a while back, and Miss Wilkerson, who'd written The Warmth of Other Suns, was on this program and spoke beautifully about the great northern migrations of Chicago and Detroit, and Philadelphia and Baltimore, and of course New York and Boston.
Absolutely.
And that is a remarkable book.
Oh, I think it's one of the best books that has been written in America.
I did too. I was deeply impressed by The Warmth of Other Suns.
Yeah.
The half of the book that has to do with the Middle Passage, slavery in the Deep South, slavery in Alabama, the Underground Railroad, Fugitive Slave Act, even Harlem, somewhat familiar to American readers. There have been books set in different ones of these places. The other sister, however, is married,
right?
the wench, to a British colonial officer. Governor, is he the governor?
He's the governor of the Cape Coast Castle.
Of the castle,
right.
Governor, yes. Not governor.
Yeah.
And then those descendants go through a different series of different experiences and different traumas. The slave trade, colonialism, the rebellion against colonialism.
Right.
One of the things that when I was going along reading about the two tribes, one who were essentially warriors and slave catchers, the other tribe who were then the Fontes, who are slave traders.
Right.
That is an argument that I have heard essentially from apologists and racists for the last 50 years, that Africans did that. And in a sense, of course, that is literally historically true.
Yeah.
But you get right in there and deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some people are kind of shocked to hear that there was any involvement whatsoever among the different African ethnic groups in helping facilitate the slave trade. And yet, I think none of this would have worked if it wasn't an elaborate system of exploitation. People being exploited by the colonial powers, also different groups exploiting each other. And so this is this kind of toxic, cyclical thing that is at work at the beginning of the novel. I focus on two groups in particular, the Ashanti, who were allied with the Dutch, and the Fanti, who were allied with the British, and kind of attempt to show exactly what these forces were that enabled them to participate in this atrocity.
Well, sadly, it couldn't have been done without them.
No.
White men could not have gone into the interior and captured slaves in the numbers and in the way that would have been necessary. It wouldn't have been possible. But the tribal conflicts and made all this possible. And then you have a character who is half caste, a mixed a mixed race young man, and I mean, this book is a kaleidoscope of stuff.
Yes.
But there's the case, an African man, not an African American, but an African man who is half white. He himself is.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that particular spot in the social spectrum is nowhere? I mean, I got this awful feeling that he was a kind of lost soul.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think his character was incredibly kind of caught in the middle of these two cultures, kind of to his detriment. And when I started writing this book, I had read another book called The Door of No Return by William St. Clair that takes you through the Cape Coast Castle. And he talks about these marriages, these unions between the white British soldiers and the local Gold Coast women. And he has a chapter about the children of these unions and kind of what became of them. And really there's kind of a lack of information about what became of them. It seemed like, you know, they were just kind of wanderers, you know, really lost.
Which way did they, insofar as we know from what research could be done, did they drift back over generations into blackness? Did they go to London and become 100 years later white people?
That's a great question.
I don't know.
I don't think there's a lot of information, unfortunately, about you know, what did become of them, other than in this book it talks about how many of them were sent to England for school.
Sure.
So they were educated abroad, and then they came back and kind of started to form Ghana's middle and upper classes.
Right.
And so I imagine that those who did return kind of ingratiated themselves with the locals even further.
And who would they marry?
Probably other Ghanaians, yeah.
Well, but there would be a real shortage of mixed race Ghanaians.
Well,
that's
yeah.
not a situation that
Right.
can endure. They would have to go some way or other.
Right. I mean, they
Yeah.
were likely marrying other Ghanaians.
Yeah. That would Americans know a little bit about Uncle Tom's Cabin and Beloved, but they don't know anything about colonialism and the rebellion against colonialism and the difficulties that went on for African areas to become African nations.
Right.
You do. What's the effect there? How did that work?
Well, you know, throughout this novel, I kind of track the various groups' struggles against colonialism. In it, I talk about the first war between the Ashantis and the British. And then from there are two other wars. The last war, the Anglo-Ashanti War of 1900, which is also known as the War of the Golden Stool, was kind of the last fight against being absorbed into the British colony that the Ashantis put forward. And they lost that war. And so from there until 1957, Ghana was under British colonial rule. And a great many leaders kind of came up through that, fought against that in other ways, not through wars necessarily. And in 57, finally, were granted, you know, the ability to you know, raise their own country.
It's yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
one thinks that Ghana has been there forever, and well, obviously the place has been there forever, but the
Right.
nation's our lifetime.
Yeah, 1957 is you know, many people have, my father was born that year, and so it's
I
a
was
very
already old.
recent history.
No, really. We mentioned the earlier, the 18th, 19th century name for the place, the Gold Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And I've only recently been learning that there was a lot of gold there.
Yes.
That this Louis Henry Gates's series, his television series, is telling us how rich the Ghanaian Empire was in the 11th century, was it 12th?
Yeah.
There's still gold there? Do people
I mean,
do people mine for gold?
it's part of the colonial project was not just exploiting the people for the purpose of slavery, but
Right.
also for the purpose of taking all of this gold. And so I think a lot of the wealth was stolen many years ago. But the Ashanti people in particular that I write about in this novel were incredibly powerful, and part of that power came from the wealth that came from the gold.
Apparently, almost all the jewelry of the Italian and English Renaissance came from Ghana and places like Ghana.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that, actually.
It was brought up, sometimes taken as far as the Nile, and then slowly traded all the way to London.
Oh, so interesting.
So that gold bracelets and what have you, worn by Queen Elizabeth I,
Right.
started out in Ghana.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they didn't get that name by mistake, the Gold Coast.
No, and they didn't find any gold in England either.
No.
So it had to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Finally, that branch of the family comes to America, so to speak, and that's a place where you handle, I think, a very delicate subject, which is the attitude, the relationship between the African immigrant and the African American. And it is, the distinctions are what are the point.
Right, right. Well, it's a complex relationship. Chimamanda Adichie talks about having to learn how to be Black once you arrive in America. I think this is kind of an unfamiliar concept for Americans because we are so accustomed to thinking racially. But if you grow up in a country on a continent where everybody around you is Black, you don't think of yourself racially first. You don't kind of go around defining yourself as Black, which is very different from how things are here. And so I think a lot of immigrants come to America and suddenly have to kind of learn a set of rules that they didn't have to learn before.
On the one hand, they have to learn that they may need to be careful about the remnants of Jim Crow.
Right.
But on the other hand, they don't understand African Americans very well either.
Right. Well, I mean, they have a completely different cultural history, which is, tied to all sorts of things, but namely just the amount of time that has passed since African Americans were themselves Africans.
Well, in China, it's not Chinese food.
Yeah.
In China, it's just food.
Right. Exactly.
Which is oddly, but yes.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
And I know that this book is still in hardback. You're still on tour. It is still selling like crazy, and you're still promoting it, and you can't have any time to write.
Yes.
But you will write, and when you do, where will you go? What will you do next?
I'm not quite sure yet. As you said, I spent much of my life with Homegoing, and so it does feel a little strange to kind of try to figure out what to do next. But I think, hopefully the next book will be set in the present. I think take a lot less research, and just kind of explore some of my other interests.
What are they?
Well, I think I'll always be interested in race and politics, but religion and femininity, I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly where it will go, but I think you'll see a lot of Homegoing, but also a departure as well.
Something about the 2017 that's just easier. You know what people wear, and you know what they eat.
Yes.
And you know their marriage customs,
Right.
and you know how they court.
Yeah, we won't have to spend as much time in the library, that's for sure.
Not at all. Well, this has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.